I am joined again today by Mark Knoy for a very special episode of Between the Levees. Mr. Knoy, thank you for coming.
Happy to be here, Tim. I really enjoyed doing the last podcast that we did, and look forward to uh, seeing what else we might find to talk about.
Yes, sir. You did ascend to first place on total listens very quickly last time around. We'd like to discuss today the history of barging and sort of the uh, process or development of matching up to a customer, shipping cargo to destination, that whole thing. So please begin. Just a rundown of the history of barging in the United States.
Know a lot more of this than I do. I was only born in 1959, so I haven't been around that long. But I have hung around most of my life with guys that are 10 to 15 years older than me. And during my time at ACBL, I had the privilege of recounting their 100 years of history. So, but just, thinking about stories my dad would tell me, and as I joined, just kind of the what most people would call the modern era of inland barging, really developed during World War II, all in an effort to support the war effort. You saw the government come in and take over many of the nation's shipyards, modernize them, turn them into, war building machines, building ships and landing crafts and things like that, building towboats and barges to haul fuel oil and other supplies. And as the war, came to an end, there was a lot of those assets that then were available back to the private industry, and certainly set up Jeff Boat for as a modern shipyard in today's environment, and many others that were involved in that building of those vessels. And then, Federal Barge Lines was formed out of that, the Valley Line. And, that all took place up through, I think, the late 50s, if you will. That's kind of where I started to learn about it from my dad. My dad was a young man that grew up in southern Indiana, ran away from home ended up at Union Lock in Evansville back in just before the start of the war, back in 1943, and worked on a towboat until he was drafted, came out of that, went back to work on a towboat. So then that's kind of where my history starts, is just stories from him. He was an engineer to start with. They called him Hot Rod. I guess he had some pretty good mechanical skills. And then he ended up tanking barges and was injured and went into the wheelhouse. So I think my dad went into the wheelhouse about the time I was born. And that's when, most of those stories really started to develop. And I think, the kind of I said that was the modern era, but if there's whatever you would phrase the current era, if you will. So you saw literally boats turn from steam power to diesel power during that period of time. And I think by the mid 60s or so, probably by the late 50s, anything being built was certainly, diesel powered, single or twin screw, propeller driven vessels. And I'm sure there's a lot of leeway here. There's lots of one offs, I'm sure. But, certainly by the early 60s, you were developing what we would call the current era of the barge industry, as you started to standardize horsepower. You started to standardize traffic patterns, importantly, barge sizes, because by now you have standardized the canalization of the Ohio River, the Upper River, the Illinois. Now everything was going to the 110 by 600 foot lock. So now you're building barges that'll fit into that, moving away from the old standard, which was 26 by 175. I think you went to some Stumbos. They stretched those out to 195. There was even a short period of time where people like Sioux City, New Orleans, as one, built 40 footers to match up to the 26 footers. But then I'm going to say end of the 50s, early 60s, you standardized to what we call the, a super or a jumbo. I guess we call them a jumbo barge, which is 35 by 195, and today would probably be 35 by 200 would be the standard. And I think I helped participate in a little bit of that, working with over at Memco Barge Lines with Chris Parsonage and Harry Waddington and a fellow by the name of Mike Rushing. Figured out that even though the lockman would tell you 595 was the maximum length into a lock, we figured out that you could put 600 foot in a 600 foot lock. And somewhere along in there, probably by the mid 90s, everybody was building 200 foot barges. Doesn't seem like a lot, but 5 foot in a barge is, another 2.5% cargo space. So I saw, I guess, my first on hands was 1973. I was just 14 years old. I lived 12 miles away from this harbor service. I had rowed the boats with my dad. And so, the mate on there would always take me out on tow and teach me a few things. So I knew what was going on there. And even though I was just a kid, I thought I could help him out. And so that was 1973. I remember that time. I think that might be the same year that the Waterways Freight Bureau went away and the barge lines were deregulated. Up until that time, even barge carriers were regulated very much like trucks and railroads were at the time. And so they were regulated up until then. And then that point is when, we really started to see the traffic patterns develop in those mid 70s as what we see today. Before that, it was basically a northbound business. You were basically bringing raw materials up the river for manufacturing of steel and other things, and support this infrastructure with clinker and cement and bringing things up the river. But there was really nothing to go back down. But then we started to export grain, and as soon as we started to export grain, then you saw people like ADM built a barge line, and Bunge was building barges. Cargill was certainly already in that phase to some degree. They were probably one of the most mature ones. I think I'm getting that right. But then you started to kind of see a proliferation of all the grain shippers got involved in the mid 70s, and you started to move to the bigger horsepower boats, the 5,000 and 6,000 horsepower boats that are pretty standard today. Before that, I remember, the Norman brothers, they ran 1,800 horsepower boats on the Illinois River forever, moving 15 barge tows, and maybe have to cut back to 12 or even 9 during extreme high water. But up through that period of time, a 3,800 was a big boat. I remember the guys down on the lower running, 16 barge tows, and a lifetime business mentor of mine, Paul Striegel, was wondering how would we ever find enough barges to move if we could move 16 barges at a time on a 3,600 horsepower boat. And of course, those barges that were coming in back then were steel covered barges. Most of the ones that existed before the steel lift tops were really steel roll tops, because the industry served the steel industry more so than anybody. If you remember back then, Ohio Barge Line, I think Orrin talked about that, about Ohio Barge Line. So you had to have those telescoping doors to fit those long pieces of steel in and out, and be able to close the barge up quickly in case it started to rain. So I remember as the grain business developed, they converted a lot of those to steel, not converted the roll tops, but they started building steel lift tops. And that was quite a day when they introduced the Proform fiberglass covers, as starting out and going through the whole barge maintenance and repair part of my career. Those steel covered doors were they heavy. And it was so much easier to work on the fiberglass covers. I remember that.
But what year was it when fiberglass covers were introduced, roughly?
Somebody's going to come on and say that. I'm going to guess sometime in the mid 70s. I don't remember exactly. I want to say that didn't Jack Lambert have something to do with that up at Twin City Barge? Somebody will know the answer to that. Proform. Somebody developed Proform. I don't know. It could have been in the late 70s or in the early 80s. Gosh, it seems like to me it must have been in the 70s. But that was a big difference, and standardizing all the barges was a big difference too. So, by that time, everybody had 195 by 35s by 12-foot hulls. That was the basic barge. And of course, today, at least in the grain business, in the covered business, many barges are now 14-foot hulls with 5-foot coamings and high cube covers, and you load them down to 11.5 foot, maybe even 12 foot out of Greenville or Lake Providence down there, and change that industry a lot. It's something that gets by people quite a bit if you're not familiar with the business. But it took us from loading 1,750 tons into a barge to 2,300, 2,400 tons in a single barge. Big difference in the industry. I don't want to skip by a lot of that stuff, but that was all being developed at that time. There was some very specialized trades that the Valley Line had some really unique barges, I think, for hauling oats and paper products. It seems like Federal Barge Lines did too. They had, Tim, you might even see an occasional T barge or F barge in your fleet. They'd be the old ones that you got from Federal Barge Lines.
Quite a few T barges.
Yeah, well, the T barge just stands for 13-foot hull. That's what the T stands for. And the F stood for 14-foot hulls so that they wouldn't get them mixed up. A pretty simple numbering scheme, right? But
Sure.
they built some bigger barges early on for some very special trades, not to get the draft as much as to get the payload, because the products were so light, the paper products, and I think oats was another one. And then, of course, as we grew more and more soybeans and started growing those, you needed bigger barges as well. So, we're somewhere around the mid 70s. Business is really booming. Everything's growing. And then, 1980, Jimmy Carter and the grain embargo, set in. And that kind of threw business in the loop for a while. I think Orrin mentioned that too. The whole 1980s. I remember my dad and I, we started the business there in Pekin in 1985, and it was one of the lowest points in the business, in the industry. I remember in the early 80s, early part of my career was influenced by a guy out of Marseilles by the name of Danny Partridge, who owned Marseilles Marine, a harbor service in Ottawa. And just gave me an opportunity to learn a lot of stuff about the river business, and from the harbor service perspective. Gosh, I lost my train of thought there. God darn it. What was I talking about, Tim?
You said a friend of yours from Ottawa.
Yeah, that was Danny Partridge. Anyway, so we're around I was thinking about the early 80s. I went down to Pekin, Illinois, and that's when I started working in the harbor service down there. And I remember what I was going to say, how bad business was then, and interest rates were in the high teens. And I imagine what that would be like trying to run a business today, and at the same time having your number one cash crop export be embargoed to the Russians. So that was a pretty rough time during that period of time. And if I'm not mistaken, that's, around that time, you saw a lot of investments in the industry through some incentive tax credits. And you saw a lot of barges getting built by individuals. And somewhere along in there, maybe the mid 80s, if Chris Parsonage listens to this, he would know his dad, Noble C. Parsonage, I'm pretty sure this story, was treasurer over at St. Louis Ship. And they were building these barges, and they were even, helping to put together packages for investors to build barges. This is during the period of time, doctors, lawyers, baseball stars, other people that had a lot of money and were looking for tax advantages were building barges. and then all of a sudden, what do we do with them? And I think Noble Parsonage would probably be given the credit of coming up with the barge management concept. And that's where Memco Barge came from, Marine Equipment Management Corporation. And quickly a few others sprung up, Frontier Gateway and Robert Miller, I remember back in those days. I don't remember a lot of the others, but there was a handful of them. And so that was the first big barge line I went to work for. And that was kind of a change in the industry where you saw a lot of the investment coming in from outside the industry, not the companies growing themselves, because they didn't need barges. So I don't know if the shipyards went out and found the investors, or the investors found the shipyards through, tax accountants. But at any rate, the two matched up, and those heavy assets cost a lot, so they spin off a lot of depreciation, and you could literally use this tax credit to get a barge built, at least the down payment. And so we started this era of barge management companies. And I certainly rode on that bandwagon with Memco starting in '94. But they were already, pretty big into it. There were some others out there that were, I think it was Carl Linder that built the American, American Barge Company, all the names, astrological name boats, the Spartan, the Spartacus. I forget the names of them now. You remember those? I think you guys ended up with a fair number of those boats, Ingram and ACBL. All of that stuff ended up going through hands several times. But you went through kind of that whole era of barge management and what have you that followed the deregulation period, the introduction of the grain guys. And then you saw, a weakness in the market, and the shipyards want to stay busy. They built these investor barges, and that went along for a pretty good while. And there's still a fair amount of that out there today. You certainly still have barge management companies out there that work alongside of the integrated barge lines as well. You might note that I haven't talked much about the tank barge business, Tim. I'm really not a tank barge guy. I think to be a true tank barge guy, you got to be in Houston. That's where the business is. I didn't do much with tank barges until I joined ACBL. And even though we had nearly 500 tank barges, if I didn't have a team of experts over there, I'd have been in a world of trouble. But I did, and they did a great job with that. So I don't really know a lot of the growth on the tank barge side, but I do know that ACBL was early into that, even before World War II. I believe they were hauling some petroleum products down along the Gulf Coast, and that business was, being born and coming along. I'm really kind of been a dry cargo guy most of my life, and then I went back following Memco, which was a barge management company, and there were still a couple regulated businesses out there, or at least regulated from the operational side, not the operational side, from the company ownership side. I went to work for American Electric Power, which was a regulated utility company, and the vast majority of the work that we did initially was for that regulated utility company. So even though we weren't regulated in that definition by any particular government entity, we serviced a regulated industry, and that was really interesting time. And then really spent the last 10 years at ACBL, where we'd like to say we're a one-stop shop. We could pretty much do anything that you wanted to do in the inland river industry. And so that's kind of what you see mirrored today, is kind of, I guess, what I'd call the current industry, where you have pretty defined traffic patterns and barge companies and customer vendor relationships and service, various river segments. That's all pretty well defined today. Not a lot of new traffic patterns, not a lot of new commodities coming to the industry. Most everything that we move is because it's the only way that the volume can get moved is by barge. And so maybe we can talk about that a little bit, or maybe I should stop and see what you think.
Well, one quick question before my next, I guess my next big one. I believe a fiberglass cover, a single fiberglass cover weighs 1 ton. Is that correct?
Um, you're certainly in the ballpark. Gosh, I'm embarrassed by this because I used to be able to rattle that right off because I knew what a set of covers weighed, but I think it's maybe just slightly less than that. I want to say a set of covers, 8 or 9. I want to say weigh right at 10 ton.
Okay.
So it's around a ton, and I think the old steel covers used to weigh 5 ton, and a roll top might have even weighed 10 ton. And so it's a substantial difference in the carrying capacity when we went to these really light high cube covers. And then of course, if you're in the grain business, that's how they really built the export grain elevators, were around handling a pretty standardized cover. And I want to say we're down to 8 or 9 fiberglass. A piece cover today is the standard. And I think, if you go to the Gulf, you'll see that standardization throughout all of the grain export elevators. They absolutely hate roll tops. I'm not even sure they'll load roll tops anymore. And if they'll load them, they won't unload them in the Gulf. So you're down to maybe 500 roll tops left in the industry, if that many. And those are going to be around very specialized trades: steel, lime, cement, things where you have to really be able to close the barge up quickly to keep the cargo dry, because they're expensive. They cost a lot more to build. Back in the old days, it used to be $100,000 more, but it'd be much more than that today, because a set of fiberglass covers today is approaching $100,000, I believe. Which a barge today is here within the last 12 months, hopper barges were being priced at $1 million. I think they might be back down closer to 850 or 900 today. But when you think of the price of equipment to get into the business, especially today, it's more than double what it was just 10 years ago. And you think about building a new boat today, and a new 6,000 horsepower boat, as I understand, it might cost you $17-18 million. And I think the vast majority of all of them built in the industry probably cost $2 to $3 million. So all of that stuff has changed significantly over the course of my career, for sure, and really in kind of the modern and current days of our industry.
And then if I don't know if I can quote you on this or if you'll know this offhand, but what does generally an open hopper, an open top barge weigh by itself?
Yeah, anywhere from 300 to 315 tons. That difference just being some people put on heavier rub rails. Some people might put on stronger transoms, beefier slope sheets, but for the most part, it's going to weigh 300 to 315 tons. And this is an interesting fact too. I think your listeners might find, when you scrap a barge, it generally weighs about 200 tons. So what happens to 100 tons of the barge? It gets scraped off on bridge piers and lock walls and other barges. And it's amazing, but you literally wear off a third of the barge's weight over the life of the barge, which is, depending on the trade, 25 to 30 years. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
I agree. I agree completely. Well, all right. So backtracking to your, I guess a bit more of your story. Tell me what you can about the histories of MEMCO, AEP, and ACBL.
Well, maybe the history of the industry. Again, I'm talking on the dry cargo side, but these numbers are really talking about in the dry cargo and the tank barge industry as a whole, as best as I could track when we were doing this history for our book at ACBL, and then just more recently keeping track of how many barges there are and that. There have been about 80 mergers over the course of kind of the modern and current era, post World War II, if you will. Today, there are about 30 operators on the dry cargo side, and there's about 30 operators on the tank barge side. I think what's the interesting number is the 6 largest dry cargo operators of covered barges operate about 80% of them. Crown's comes in as the largest open top operator and has a pretty significant share of the market in that regard. And I think if you look over on the tank barge side, you would see that the top 6 or 7 players there operate nearly 80% of the barges being operated. And I think one other a difference over the course of that time is who owns the equipment in the industry, who operates it, which is sometimes different than that used to not always be the case. If it was an ACBL barge, well, of course ACBL owned it and they operated it. But today the capitalization of the industry has changed a lot. There are private investors, there are other financial investors, there are insurance companies and banks that own barges and lease them, or they're mortgaged. It's just a different business today. There used to be it seems like to me it's kind of cycles through corporate ownership to individual private ownership, back to corporate ownership, to public ownership, to private equity ownership. It's certainly a lot different today than what it has been over its past, and I'm sure it'll go through several more evolutions as time goes by. Certainly, Memco went from a very small operator of managed barges. I want to say we're at 400 or 500 barges back in the early 90s, and we built 600 brand new barges. So we went from a barge manager to a barge owner, operator, and then AEP bought that barge line. And before that, they had bought OF Shear. While I was at AEP, we bought probably 4 or 5 other smaller operators like Sun and Olympic and Blasky and Rushing, and there's a few others around there. And then when we merged with ACBL, of course, ACBL had been, at least on the dry cargo side, the largest aggregator, in the industry, with Valley Line and Sioux City, New Orleans, and Security and National Marine, and it goes on. And Orrin talked to this as well. Certainly, Ingram has been a large aggregator as well. Maybe not as many, but larger bites. Buying off, as he mentioned, Federal Barge Lines and Ohio Barge Line, and seems like they maybe bought a liquid one somewhere along the way. But anyway, I think what we've seen over the course of the last 20 to 30 years is just consolidation in a big way. I remember when the Valley Line sold to ACBL. They were known as one of the biggest barge lines. I think they had 910 barges. Sitting here today, most people would argue whether or not that'd be a large barge line today, when you have people out there operating 3, 4, maybe even close to 5,000 pieces of equipment. So I don't know. It seems like I've gotten off on a rabbit trail from what you'd asked me originally, but I would say I would define the current era as a area of consolidation, a period of consolidation, refinement. Certainly, you have to talk about all the big boats that got built, starting back in the mid 70s, mid to late 70s. It seemed like everybody had to have a 10,000 horsepower boat. We've probably refined that to some degree over the years, but I think there's only, gosh, I used to know this number by heart too. I want to say there's like 60 10,000 horsepower boats and another 100 boats between 6,600 and 9,000. And that grew and matured very quickly, and then it was over. I think John Eckstein over at Marquette built 3 9200s over the course of the last decade or so. But you look back, we haven't been building any 10,000 horsepower boats in a long time. The kind of 6,000 horsepower boats become the workhorse, go anywhere, do anything boat of the industry to some degree. Again, not referencing the canals, but even over on the liquid side, you've seen a real change of boat power where, probably less of a standardization there, but you got all these twin screw 2,000, 2,500 horsepower boats that are kind of the standard, workhorse of that industry as well. And we've seen lots of modernization and all of those things.
If you want to touch on sort of the history briefly, the history and development of Memco, and then how AEP got into the tugboat industry, and then when ACBL, just very brief. I know you said there's a book all about ACBL's 100-year history.
Yeah,
but...
well, I think again, I know somebody will come on and help us out with that. I want to say Memco was formed somewhere in the early to mid 80s, and ran through a sale to Electric Fuels Corporation, which was a division of Florida Power. And then they concentrated on hauling coal until probably sometime in the early 90s. I think Electric Fuels bought them around 90, 91, 92. And they did that until 2000 when AEP bought them. And AEP had, yeah.
Before we get to that, explain to me a barge management company versus a barge operator. You said Memco originally had 500 barges and was a barge management company. What does that mean versus what I know of, the Ingrams and ACBLs?
Yeah, so you would have private investors would own barges, like I was talking about. The doctors, the lawyers, the financial investors would own barges, and they would own them primarily for the tax benefits, more so than anything else. And so they didn't know how to operate them. They normally did not own towboats. They certainly didn't have the personnel and the expertise. So Memco stood up a company that had the expertise, knew how to operate a barge, had access to horsepower. So back in those days, you would charter in horsepower. There were a lot of people that just ran boats. There were a lot of tramp towing boats out, boats that you could charter fully found. A lot of Huffman went through a period of time where Huffman did a lot of that, operated investors' boats and towed for other people. Remember GW Gladders, they were around. They did a lot of towing for people. And so you would literally charge them a flat rate of maybe, I want to say the market today is somewhere around $10 to $15 a day to manage the barge, and a percentage of the income. So maybe 3% of the gross income. So that gave you an incentive as a management company to take good care of the barge, because you got compensated in that daily management fee of $10 a day. Back in the Memco's days, that might have been $7, but you got paid a flat rate to take care of the barge. So you would manage the operation of the barge. You would also be responsible to find the revenue for the barge, and then return the balance to the owner. So you would go out and find a customer, find a way to get the barge to them, get it loaded, move it, clean it, repair it, subtract all of that from the revenue, take your 3% of the gross, take out your daily management fee, and then send the investor the balance. And so you did not have the capital invested in the business. The barge owner actually had the capital invested in the business. Now, while I say that, certainly Memco, over a period of time, bought their own barges and even managed barges for their own family and things like that. So I don't want it to think that that's all they did, but that's what they started with. Was I think Chris would tell you they had a checkbook in hand, and they knew how barges ran up and down the river. And his dad was building these barges over at St. Louis Ship, I think. And his customers were really, as I said, buying them for the tax reasons, and then they would just tie them up and saying, hey, here's a better mousetrap. Let's run them. Let's operate them. You'll get a return. And I think that all was a good plan. But then, when the grain embargo came and we really kind of negatively impacted the grain market for that period of time, and then the tax laws changed too. A lot of the building that we saw, during during the teens, the 2000, call it 2010 to 2020, a lot of that was driven by tax incentives as well, where you got accelerated depreciation on your barges. You could build a barge for $500,000 and get a $500,000 deduction right off your taxes. So somebody needed to operate that. So, Memco had, had salespeople, had barge dispatchers, had barge maintenance groups. As they grew, then they needed a fleet in the Gulf to be able to hold the barges, maintain them. Then they needed towboats to move them. They developed a joint venture with Scott Shotan called Show Me. They bought a couple boats and operated them. Matter of fact, one of them might have been one of the former Gladder's boats. And then, so over a period of time, they just kept stacking them on top. Here'd become another 100 barges, another 100 barges, and more boats, and then formed Metco and built boats and bought boats. And I think over that period of time went, from their beginnings, again, sometime in the 80s to 2000, I want to say we had a dozen boats and 600 barges and a pretty good size operation in the Gulf. So that's what Memco did. And the last portion of its career, they were primarily around to deliver coal to international marine terminals, which they owned as well. And that coal then went to Florida to power the Big Bend station just down from Tampa. And as that business, matured and got really good at it, what do you do next? Well, then we started to build a commercial barge line around that. And I remember working with Chris on that, what we called the whole enchilada. We went to him and said, we want to build 600 barges and 5 or 6 towboats. And I think we built the 600 barges and 3 8,000 horsepower towboats. And that took us through the year 2000. And they had already sold the company to Electric Fuels Corporation that the Parsonage family had. I want to say around 90, 91, 92, something like that. And so then Electric Fuels, which was a division of a division of Florida Power, was purchased by Carolina Power and Light. Carolina Power and Light was a landlocked utility based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Had no idea, what barges were, and had no interest in barges. And so they put the barge line up for sale right away, and it took about a year to work through that process. And as they worked through that process, they found a buyer, and the buyer was a deregulated piece of American Electric Power. And this was ran by a former commodity trader. And their idea was to kind of capture the coal market on the Ohio River. And at the time, they were going to buy the Ohio River Company and Memco Barge Line. And this is all through the year. And then 9/11 hit. And when 9/11 hit, everybody took a pause. And I got a phone call. I remember getting a phone call from AEP, and they're saying, we're not really sure what to do. The world is going to change, and just kind of, put everything on hold for a minute. They were able to unwind the Ohio River Company deal, which then allowed Ingram to buy Ohio River Company. And but they could not unwind the deal with Carolina Power and Light. So they ended up with Memco Barge Line. And I had a great working relationship with a guy there that ran, back in those days, they called it RTD, the River Transportation Division of AEP. Everybody called it RTD. And a guy there by the name of Keith Darling. And as we put the two companies together, Keith came over and ran operations. And I think when we melded the two companies together, AEP had 600 barges and 12 or 15 towboats, a very nice boat fleet. And I think that's right. Yeah, I want to, yeah. around 600 barges and a dozen boats, and we combined the two, AEP and MEMCO, and ended up with 1,800 barges. And then over the course of the next 10 years, through acquisitions and a building program, we doubled the size of that company up to about 3,600 barges. And then I left there in 11 and went to work for ACBL, who then actually acquired AEP River Operations in 2015. And that's what you see with ACBL today, is the combination of these two companies along with all the other ones that they had acquired. Not a lot changing, just, less people doing the same amount of work, working smarter, hopefully, versus harder. Systems have taken a lot of, have provided a lot of opportunity and taken away a lot of the mundane work. But you work in that area, or you were. Congratulations on your promotion. You're getting away from that day to day and more into the future. But as you know, systems, and I'm talking about computer systems, have really allowed us to do so much more today and manage fleets. I remember back in the day we had barge boards, with barge numbers up on them, and you could only move so many of those around a day. But heck, today you can manage 4,000 barges on a computer screen with a good team, and so it's really changed the industry in that regard.
Yes, sir. Explain what you can for the listeners of matching barge capacity to customer need, the whole process from sales leads to delivery.
Well, in most of the time, you want your barge to be utilized every single day. I mean, there's two common denominators that we measure cost and success in our industry, and that's barge days and ton miles, either revenue per ton mile or cost per ton mile, and then the number of days it takes to do it. So things change by the season, Tim, because it's a supply-demand world. For the most part, we're at equilibrium in the industry today. We haven't always been. For the most part, we've generally been long supply, because once you build a barge, it lasts 30 years. So you better be right when you make that decision. And only recently, and I say recently, within the last decade or so, have we finally retired all of those investment barges that were built that were kind of overshadowed our industry for a long time. So for most of the time, you want to have a barge come up the river loaded and turn around and go back down the river loaded. And I think, something that people would probably catch on to fairly easily would taking a barge load of fertilizer from the Gulf up to Peoria, Illinois, and discharging that fertilizer and turn around and load that with soybeans and come back to the Gulf Coast. And the grain portion of it is relatively easy. Where it used to be just an open cry pit system where people would shout out, I need a barge at this rate, and I've got one at this rate. Today, it's just telephone conversations and text exchanges and emails, and but basically the big grain originators. So I'm talking about ADM and Cargill and CGB and Bunge for the most part, and Harvest States. Those are the big ones. They're out every day looking for whatever freight they need that they can't cover themselves. So they will advertise either in a phone call or an email, or call up their favorite barge line and say, hey, I need to move a barge load of grain next week from Peoria to the Gulf. And if you're ACBL or Ingram or CGB or one of the larger grain carriers, you're going to say, okay, I've got a barge there, and it's currently trading at 400% of tariff, and I'll sell it to you for that. And there's kind of standard terms and conditions that exist, and you make a deal. And so let's say that we've decided to load that barge at Peoria for 400% and take it to the Gulf. So the freight rate, there is a system of freight rates that exist, Tim, that stair step their way up from the Gulf all the way to Chicago, all the way to St. Paul, up to Cincinnati. that essentially say, if you moved a barge under normal operating conditions from Vicksburg at 100% of tariff, you would essentially get paid the same amount of earnings as if you moved one from Hennepin at 100% of tariff. That's the way the system was thought out. So tariff at Vicksburg might be $2.37 a ton, $2.37 a ton, and the tariff at Hennepin is $5.07 a ton. So therefore, you get paid more because you went further away. So that's fairly easy to understand. And then demand says, okay, well, I know you've got these tariff differentials by how far away we are, which really relates to a physical distance, if you will. But now, there's more demand at Peoria than there is at Vicksburg. So I might want to charge you more than tariff to go all the way up to Hennepin. And at the same time, these tariff numbers were established in 1973 at 1973 costs. And I may not have to remind you, but diesel fuel probably cost less than a quarter a gallon. And my guess is pilots were making maybe $100 a day. Deckhands were probably making $10, $15 a day. So, totally different world, but those were established. So over time, the percent of tariff that you move at has moved up to, keep up with inflation and demand. So let's say you've agreed to move this barge out of Hennepin for 400% of the tariff. The tariff's $5. So you've agreed to move it for $20 a ton. Now you're going to want to make sure that they load that barge as heavy as they can load it to the maximum draft to get the maximum payload. So you're getting paid $4 $20 a ton. I want to load that barge to 10 foot because there's a little extra water on the Illinois River. So I'm going to load it with 1,750 tons of soybeans at $20 a ton. And so the customer agrees to do that. And under the standard terms and conditions, they get 3 days to load the barge and 3 days to unload the barge. So you constructively place the barge, which means the barge is available for you to load. And they generally do that at 0700 every day. And so they place the barge for you to load. Now you, as the shipper, the guy that has the soybeans, you're going to call that barge over from the fleet. So a tug is going to shift that empty barge over to your dock. You're going to load that barge, and then that barge is going to shift back over to the fleet. And of course, that costs $400 or $500 each way to do that, or some multiple of that, depending on where you are. And then that barge will sit there generally for 2 or 3 days, and a line boat will come by and pick it up. And if you're coming out of Peoria, probably a 5,000 horsepower boat's going to pick it up, probably take it to St. Louis, probably drop it in a St. Louis fleet where they'll aggregate 25 of those together and have a 6,000 horsepower boat, take them out of there towards the Gulf. Or if you're a bigger operator, you might leave there with 30 and pick up another 5 at Cairo, or even leave out of Cairo with 40 or 46 and take that barge down to the Gulf. So now you're paying for all of that. The tower, the barge line, is paying to have the barge towed from Peoria down to St. Louis, interchange, drop it off the tow into the fleet, hold it for a few days, gather up the rest of the barges, bring it out. A big boat picks it up and takes it 1,000 miles down to the Gulf, drops it in a fleet, gets broken out of the fleet, gets held there, puts on lineup, and it gets shifted to an export elevator. They unload it, it gets shifted back, and you clean it. So the barge company is paid to tow the barge, give or take from Peoria. So 225 miles to St. Louis, another 1,050 miles down to the Gulf Coast, drop it into a fleet to and from the elevator and back. All of that's going to cost, say, $15,000. And, he's getting paid 20 times 1,750. So he's getting paid $35,000. He's got to subtract all of that cost and then clean it and repair it. So, maybe he's made, somewhere around $20,000 on the barge. Got paid 35, spent 15, maybe he spent 20. And so he's got that balance left over, but he had to get the barge up there, and it's not free to take a barge, 1,300 miles up the river. So typically what you do is you'll either have spot contracts or annual contracts to move fertilizer back up the river. And let's just say you're moving fertilizer for CF Industries out of Donaldsonville, Louisiana, and you owe them 5 barges a week. And their preference is they want to load a barge every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So you make barges available for them to load on those days. And in doing so, in exchange for that, they will pay you, let's say in today's environment, they'll pay you $20 a ton to go up to Peoria. So again, the same thing, you're going to load the barge. You're going to get a certain number of free days to load the barge. You're going to shift it from the fleet over there. They're going to load it. You're going to shift it back to the fleet, build it into a big tow to go up the river. If you're at ACBL, you're going to build it into a big tow to probably go northbound on a 10,000 horsepower boat to Cairo. Then you're going to bust up maybe 40 or 50 barge northbound tow into 2 or 3 tows to go up the Ohio and up the Upper and up the Illinois. And you're going to have another 6,000 horsepower boat take it from Cairo and bypass St. Louis and go right up the Illinois River. And so it's kind of the exact opposite thing, although it generally costs more to go up the river than it does to come down the river. That being said, the bigger the boat that you use, the more barges you move at a time, generally the cheaper it is per ton mile to do that. So in this case, we've told CF Industries, we'll give you a barge, every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for the year. So we'll load 250 barges a year with you for $20 a ton. We'll give you 2 or 3 days to load it, 3 or 4 days to unload it. We'll maximize the amount of money that we'll spend to clean it after you unload it, which incentivizes you to get all your product out of the barge. When you go unload a fertilizer barge, some terminals will put a bobcat and a man with a broom down there and a bucket and get every kernel of, every pearl of fertilizer out of the barge. And sometimes you'll, take it to another dock and they'll leave a pickup truck load of fertilizer in the barge. So you generally try to put minimum and maximums on cost and revenue so that you really know what you've got. And then all of that, of course, because we contract from carriage or for carriage of the goods from A to B, the quicker you do it, the more money you make. So it's not a lot different than most modes of transportation. You're highly incentivized to move it as fast as you can. So in a good season of operating conditions, you can run those numbers. You generally make 100 miles a day on a Locken River and 200 miles a day southbound on the lower and 100 miles a day northbound. You can kind of run through that math, and pretty soon you're like, okay, if I can maybe do all of that in 40 days, I get paid the same amount of money if it took me 2 months to do it. So I'd make a lot less money if it's moving slowly. I'd make a lot more money if it's moving faster. So what you do is you add all of that revenue together, both the southbound revenue that you got paid $20 a ton, and this time you took 1,750 tons downriver because you knew what the river stages were. But when you loaded the barge to go back upriver to the Illinois, you had to limit it to 9 foot because that's all the Corps guarantees you is a 9-foot channel. And by the time you get back up there, you could be around to average pool. So now I'm at 9 foot. I've lost 200 tons of payload. So now at $20 a ton going up the river, I'm only moving 1,550 tons. Okay. So I get paid maybe 35,000 coming down the river. I maybe get paid 33,000 going up the river. I collect all that revenue, add all that together, subtract all my costs. I'm left with a net of maybe in this case, a lot of the times you'll end up getting the barge upstream by just really covering your cost. A lot of times that's the way the northbound works, is it basically pays you to get up the river and you make all your money coming down the river. So we had said that, okay, we had made maybe $20,000 on the first leg, and we did all of that in a 40-day round trip. So you simply just take your $20,000 and you divide it by 40 days and you've made $500 a barge day. That is a pretty good earnings. I think most people shoot for somewhere between $200 and $300 a day today on barge earnings. If you had to replace barges, that's about what it would cost you to own and operate a barge today, is somewhere probably around $200 a day. So you've got to make something north of that before you put any of that money in your pocket. And then, of course, you've got all of the overhead that goes along with it. You've got to pay that too. And that can run, I don't know, $10 to $15 a day. So, you know, there's a lot of things that come out of that. I'm always amazed at how rich people that work in the industry think the barge owner is. But I can tell you, whether we like it or not, we generally make money about 2 out of every 10 years. And it's a very tough business to excel in because there's so much competition, and because so much of the equipment is controlled by the shipper. And so therefore the shipper knows what the costs are because they run their own barges, and they're sure as heck not going to pay you a nickel more than what they have to get that done. So, you know, no different than, you know, if you called up a truck broker, you know, the shipper's always looking for the best price. Now there is some reliability, performance, quality, some of those things come into mind as well. It kind of depends on who you're working for and what their ethos are, you know, within their company. But that's kind of generally how that works. Most of the grain trades on the spot market. Most of the northbound trades on generally annual contracts. The really big shippers like Holcim, big cement company, big steel companies like Nucor and US Steel, really big fertilizer shippers, big salt shippers, they'll all contract multi-years, 2, 3, maybe even 5-year contracts. Utility companies used to be in that market as well. So most of the time, the shippers find the barge lines has been my experience, because you know, I think it all you know, it kind of all gets down to what do you want, Tim? And you want a hot water heater, right? So, well, how do we get one? Well, we gotta haul, you know, white goods up to Knoxville where they make them, and haul them back out of there. So you know, these traffic patterns get developed a basis where people live and what the demand is. Now, most of that's been done over the course of time. You know, the Ohio River being a very industrial power generation river, you know, a lot of that's based on Mother Nature, where the ores and, you know, what nature provides us, where those come from. Of course, the Illinois and the upper, much more, you know, the breadbasket, much more grain. You know, so many of those patterns got developed over long periods of time. So I guess when the first barge and the first hunk of coal came together, I think that was back in about 1915 on the Kentucky River somewhere. But today those patterns are pretty well established. Nucor certainly knows who the major barge carriers are, who can supply them with their needs. They've used all of them over the course of time, so they know who's reliable and who's dependable, who they can count on for good quality equipment. And, you know, it's no different than, you know, you go into the grocery store and you got a choice to pick out a lot of different canned goods or frozen products. And which ones do you pick out? The ones you like. And generally it's for different reasons. It's for the quality, or it's for the price, or it's the size of the packaging, or Barging's really, it's not a very complex deal. You're buying the transport of your goods from point A to point B. It can get complicated to execute on, but the contracting is pretty simple. There are force majeure language in most contracts, not all, but most contracts have force majeure clauses that protect both the shipper and the carrier being the barge company, from things outside of their control. So, typical language is strikes, riots, civil commotion, and Mother Nature. So in our industry, what we generally face is high water, low water, ice. We do have some strikes, riots, governmental intervention. So lock closures, come into mind more so. Which the good news is we're getting a lot more money to take care of our locks and dams. The bad news is it takes time to do that. So we have a lot more lock closures. But I think as we go through this next decade, you're going to see the system improve dramatically with reference to reliability.
Explain to me, because I really don't know, the structure, I guess, and development of the grain market. Why were tariffs set in 73 and now today we're selling at 400% of tariff? Why was that never adjusted? Why was it structured the way it was? Do you know?
Well, and again, I'm not an expert in this. I think you would find some old grain shippers or grain carriers that might, I think you get comments on some of these that might come in and help us. But I think it was just purely the fact that the regulatory body went away. So the Waterways Freight Bureau used to be the regulatory body over the barge industry, and they deregulated the industry, I think, in 1973. So you had this set of numbers that were all set in place. And so as, inflation came along, people would say, well, I can no longer do that at the tariff. I remember back in the late 70s, early 80s, things traded at 110% of tariff, 120% of tariff. We didn't see numbers like we see today until, the more recent times. But as I said, going back to 1973, I really don't know what diesel was. I'm sure it was less than a quarter. It might have been less than a dime. I do remember the wages a bit because I was working then, making $15 a day. And I remember my dad was making $100 a day. And I was thinking like, man, if I could ever get there, how good would life be then, right? So you just think about all the inflation has taken place, and the market just tries to keep that inflation revenue to cover the inflation that we've seen. So also, all the northbound was regulated. So you in the old days, you would just get out your book and say, here's the regulated price to haul steel from New Orleans to Chicago, and you got paid that much money. There was no debate about it. And airlines were that way, trucking companies were that way, telephone, everything was regulated. In my lifetime, everything's been deregulated, and one could argue whether that's for the betterment or not. But I think overall, you can do about anything that you need to do today in a non-regulated environment. So that's where that comes from. Is the Waterways Freight Bureau just went away. And when it went away, whatever they had published is what they had published. They do use that as a guideline, but since then, the National Grain and Feed Association has developed barge freight. Let's see, how do they say it? Grain barge freight trading rules. But they're basically the same that they've always been. There's it's iterative in price to keep up with inflation, where it used to be standards for year was 5 free days to load, 5 to unload, $100 a day for 10 days, and $200 a day for 10 days, and $300 a day thereafter. Well, now it's like 3 and 3, and I think that the demurrage is approaching $300 and $400 a day. because that's just what it costs. I think what people lose sight of is the entry cost, the capital costs today are just so much greater. As I mentioned early on, you're dealing with $1 million barges. This on the dry cargo side. Again, tank barges are multiples of that. But you're dealing with $1 million barges. What we think about as little boats today cost $6 or $7 million. A mid-range boat, a 6,000 is going to cost you $16-17 million. And the people that work on those boats, deckhands, make from $250 a day, give or take, up to sky's the limit competition, right? And you got pilots that make from $800 to $1,000 a day, and everything just has went up so much that you now need multiples of those prices just to keep even. Ideally, the 100% of tariff gave you enough of a margin that would incite you to invest in barges and build the equipment. I think today break even out of St. Louis is somewhere around 400% of tariff. So that's just the equivalent of what inflation in our business has been over, what is that, 50 years. It's went up 4 times. So I don't know what that comes down to if we looked at that on an annual basis, but it seems reasonable when you think about it.
Well, Mr. Knoy, that just about does it for this one. I do appreciate your time again. Anything else to share?
No, look, I've always been passionate about the barge business, and I love the opportunity to share. In the end, that's all I really have is my experiences and the knowledge I've gained over the course of my career. So, whatever your listeners are looking for, and if I can help educate, I'm happy to do that.
Well, come to think of it, as I'm listening to you speak, one final question, unrelated to everything we just covered. How many episodes of this show have you watched?
Well, because I was honored to be, get to watch it the first time. I've watched all of them that I thought had, well, I guess I've watched all of them. Not some of them aren't maybe my cup of tea quite as much as the others, but I love all these stories about what's going on in the river industry, and it's great to hear the next generation coming along. I think that's really exciting. It's just been a good industry. I've really enjoyed working in it. It's provided a great living for me and my family and many of my teammates over the years. So, it's interesting. I when I was working, I never had time for social media. And since I retired, I'm fascinated with how much knowledge is at your fingertips, whether it be through the podcast like you do, or YouTube, or TikTok. And I the ag community and towboats and barges are all over, Facebook and anything. It's just amazing what's out there and what you can learn. And I'm just fascinated with it because I never had time to browse around social media when I was working. I just had so much else to read. So I find it interesting. I like it. I guess to some degree, this is my only input. Otherwise, I just take from it. I'm not one that's going to post very much. Once in a while, if I catch a big fish, I might show my friends out there. But otherwise, I don't post. I just take.
Well, I got you. Do you want to tell me about what your life has been the last month and a half since we last spoke?
Well, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the river business. I think I told you I've got a son that lives in California. So we spent the month of January out in California with our 2-year-old granddaughter, Maxine. And we just learned that we're going to have another granddaughter in California in August. And so then I've been home for a couple of weeks and went to Mexico to go fishing for a week, tuna fishing, which was really nice. And actually going back here in another week to go fishing again. So, and avoid some of the cold weather. So not very much of barging. I can't think of anything I really miss about work other than the people and the intellectual challenge. And so I guess that's a couple things I miss. I miss the challenge. I miss the people. A lot of great people in our industry. I think it's over the years we saw a lot of people come from other industries, especially other transportation industries. I don't know what it is that brings us together, where we're fierce competitors, but then we all go to Mardi Gras together, or some convention, and I think it's the part about helping the mariner that brings us all together. When people have an accident, they don't say who did that and how did it happen. They say, how can I help? What can I do to help? And I think it's a pretty cool industry in that regard, that we all work together to make it successful for all of the customers and employees and owners in the industry. It's a pretty cool industry in that regard.
Well, as I said, sir, thank you very much again for your time.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Take care.
See you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.